Howdy, folks. This video is from a show I recently did on Cameron Bertuzzi's channel, Capturing Christianity. If you like it, do all the YouTube things to let YouTube know to show the video to others. Be sure to like, comment, and share the video. And I am trying to grow my channel, so be sure and subscribe and hit the bell notification. Don't forget to check out Capturing Christianity and support the work that Cameron is doing there. Hope you enjoy this.
Well, I just want to make a quick comment first and then ask my question. The comment is I work in the hospital and I deal with a lot of patients that have had heart attacks. And I can recall one patient that told me he's died twice. And it was in the ICU. I think they were, running a code on him, chest compressions. And he said he was hovering above his body and he saw on one of the medication pumps like a serial number, and he was able to memorize that and then asked the nurse when, he was resuscitated if those numbers were actually on there, and they were. So I just thought that was really interesting.
And before your question, there are similar cases in the literature where people have memorized serial numbers from things they saw in the hospital and then reported it back. There are some cases like that in the Self Does Not Die book.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. He told me it was very peaceful. He went and saw, family members, friends, and that he's not afraid to die after that experience. But my question is, there's a book I read many years ago, and I'm sure you've heard of it. It's called Proof of Heaven by neurosurgeon Eben Alexander. And, he has this very vivid account of the afterlife, and it's very believable. And to me, certain aspects seem to, match the Bible, the Christian story. For example, he said he went in the presence of the Supreme Creator, and that God is love, and he felt connected to the entire universe. And but the thing that's always bothered me is he doesn't ever mention an encounter with Jesus. And Jesus says no one goes to the Father except through him. And so I don't know what to make of that. On the one hand, his story sounds so believable, and this message of love, and that's our ultimate purpose. I guess, I see that as consistent with the Christian faith, but then to be in the presence of that Supreme Creator without having first gone through Christ or talking to Christ, I just don't know what to make of that.
Okay, well, let me address that issue first, and then I'll give you my overall impression of Eben Alexander, because I've read his book. I think people, if they stay in the afterlife long enough, will end up, as a Christian, I would say, I think they will meet Jesus. But that doesn't happen instantaneously. Even Jesus himself, in his parable of Lazarus and the rich man, describes a progression of events in the afterlife where you're not immediately at your final destination. He says, for example, Lazarus died and then was carried by the angels to the bosom of Abraham. So that implies there's a kind of transitional period between the moment of death and when you arrive at your final destination in the afterlife. Now, I think ultimately, if you stay in the afterlife long enough, you will end up meeting Jesus. And there are many accounts of that exact thing happening. In fact, there's a whole book I've got that looks at this from a Christian perspective, where they went looking for, okay, do people see Jesus in the afterlife, or do they also see Buddha, or do they also see Muhammad, or, do you see whoever you believe? And what this author found in the research he did was that you have an overwhelming number of Jesus reports and only outlier reports of anybody else. Even people who were not Christian would end up seeing Jesus. So I think that if you stay long enough, that's going to happen. And if Eben Alexander had stayed long enough, I would assume it would happen with him too. But number one, he may not have stayed long enough. Number two, he may not remember it, because you're trying to, when they restart your heart, that's not a guarantee you're going to remember everything you experienced. And so, in fact, a lot of people don't even remember having an NDE. And so there may be a data retention problem of trying to retain data about what you experienced in the afterlife and then translating it back into human processable memories. And there could be memory loss as a result. So he may have met Jesus and just not remembered it. The third problem, though, and this is where I kind of transition into telling you my opinion about Eben Alexander. Now, I already mentioned with Kevin that that anytime anybody writes a book about their experience, I'm suspicious. I'm more suspicious when their case is an outlier. And one of the things about Eben Alexander's experience, by the way, for people who may not know him, he was a neurosurgeon who got encephalitis in the brain and spent 11 days in a coma or something like that, and then came back with this experience report. So, and those facts, like he was in a coma for 7 days, for however many days it was with encephalitis, that's all verified. But
I did want to mention, Jimmy, right before you come back on that, is that I've actually had him on the channel. So he was on with actually Gary Habermas, who Gary Habermas is super big on NDEs as well. So they had a conversation on Capturing Christianity. If you guys are interested, go search for Eben Alexander and Gary Habermas on Capturing Christianity. You'll be able to find it and watch that. They actually were slated to come on and discuss reincarnation, because that's one of the things that Eben has been drawn to now as a result of his experience. He's now convinced that reincarnation is real. So that's what they were going to talk about. We just never got it planned out. But just wanted to mention that really quickly.
Okay. So Eben Alexander's experience is an extreme outlier. There are many dissimilarities. Now, he has some common elements, like meeting God. That's pretty common. Feeling love. That's very common. But there are other aspects of his experience that just do not fit the standard profile remotely. Like, he reports that in his experience, he did not have any knowledge of his earthly life. It's like he forgot his earthly identity. And I'm not aware of other people reporting that. That's a very different experience if it's a real experience. And he may have perceived all this in his coma, but it doesn't fit the standard model. And so that gives me reason to question this experience. And there are other reasons too, but to just give it a bottom line, I would put Eben Alexander's experience in what I'd call my gray basket. Unlike, it's not in my black basket like Kevin Malarkey and Betty Eady and Dannion Brinkley. It's also not in my white basket. I'd put it somewhere in the middle. I don't know what to make of it fully. I don't have the evidence to accuse him of hoaxing. He may have genuinely perceived all of this, but what I can say is his experience is atypical. And so I think in order to do significant research, we need to look at what do most people report, not to what do the outlier experiences look like.
Okay. And do you think it would be a problem for the Christian faith if, say, his experience was genuine, it really happened, but he went in the presence of the Father before, coming and seeing Christ?
I think that that the afterlife is so complex that it exceeds our present ability to understand. And so if he came back with that as what he remembered of his experience, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I'd have a much bigger problem with his endorsement of reincarnation, but that appears to be something that is not rooted in his experience itself.
Okay. If you have time, I did have one other question.
Real quick.
Yeah, feel free.
I don't know if you've heard of Brian Melvin. There's like a YouTube video on his testimony with maybe 3 million views. But I think he was an atheist guy, and he said he went to hell and saw Hitler. But this experience he initially had, he said it looked like heaven, and the people there thought it was heaven. What he described, it seemed very similar to me to purgatory. And then he quickly realized it wasn't heaven, and even though these people thought that they were in, I guess the heavenly afterlife, it actually
like the good place.
Yeah. It was the opposite, and there were layers to it, and he descended deeper and deeper, and then was in the presence of demonic forces. But after the experience, he said he became Christian. I think he's Baptist or some, Protestant denomination, and he goes and tries to evangelize like Native Americans. Mm-hmm. But he seemed like, a genuine person. It, seemed a credible testimony. My question is, as a Catholic, we take the Eucharist as literal, sacramental body, blood of our Lord. And Jesus says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man, you have no life in you. Was he speaking in hyperbole, saying that? I know God's not bound by his sacraments, but I guess what's the Catholic position on like people that don't receive the Eucharist, but, God still can admit them into the afterlife?
So this is specific to a Catholic point of view. So I can answer the question, but we're getting a little bit removed from the scientific research into an afterlife. But from a Catholic point of view, God only holds people accountable for what they know. He doesn't hold people accountable for what they don't know. And so if someone doesn't know that they need to receive the Eucharist, then God's not going to hold them accountable for that. You only get held accountable for what you know. And so if someone is innocently ignorant of any number of truths, but they otherwise cooperate with the grace and the light that they have, then God will make a place for them in heaven. This is just the same issue as, can someone be saved without consciously knowing about Jesus? Well, Jesus is the way that God wants us to approach him to be saved. But if someone is innocently unaware of the fact they need to do that, then many Christians, including Catholics, would say, well, God will have an allowance for that. He's not going to hold people accountable for things they innocently didn't realize. And the same thing is true about receiving the Eucharist or any other point of Christian doctrine that you might want to mention. By the way, in regard to this gentleman that you mentioned, I have not seen his video, so I can't really form a conclusion about his experience. But if I would note that about 20% of NDEs include negative elements, and some of them are described as hellish. So the idea that everybody just has this blissed out, everything's so wonderful in the afterlife experience, that is not true of everybody. That seems to be true of about 80% of people, but it is not true of the other 20%.
Howard Storm, I think, is one of the main people. Maybe that's the wrong term to use, but he's a very prominent case. His case of near-death experiences is really interesting. It was actually featured in the movie that actually just came out on near-death experiences After Death, who I interviewed the director of that movie. It's on Capturing Christianity. I also interviewed one of the cardiologists that was featured in that film as well. So if you guys are interested, go check those out.
And before we go, just a reminder to do all those great YouTube things. You can help my channel grow by liking, commenting, and sharing the video. And be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you always get notified when I have a new video. These days, I have multiple videos coming out every week. Thanks so much, and God bless you.